How far can we push the boundaries of human cognition? Anders Sandberg, a leading researcher on long-term futures, explores the possibilities of whole brain emulation and advanced neuroscience. In this guest lecture, he joins Beatrice Erkers in conversation to discuss the potential for mind-machine integration, the case for digitizing consciousness, and how these technologies could redefine intelligence, identity, and the future of human cognition.
I am very happy to be here today with Anders Sandberg. And Anders, I can see you put your foresight pin on. Thank you so much for doing that. That's very nice. So yes, let's start. Could you maybe just introduce yourself and tell all the people watching what it is that you're working on?
So my background is very mixed, but I started in computer science and then I took a course on neural networks and I fell in love with the idea of making computers that use brain-like methods for thinking and solving problems. So I took courses in neuroscience, in psychology and medical engineering because I wanted to make neurointerfaces. I also realized that, neurointerfaces are really hard, so let's do software instead. And then later on, I ended up at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, which was part of a philosophy department. So I usually describe myself as a bit of a futurist and a bit of a philosopher, but I have a fair bit of science background. And I'm extremely interested in the long-term future of humanity and how to make that one better. So that involves both avoiding existential risks, but also thinking about what can these technologies that we can see on the horizon do for us, and how can we get the most benefit from them? So that's what I'm working on.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a short introduction of all the many things you're doing, I think. I think one thing that could be interesting for people to hear is, because you mentioned existential risk, for example, and I know this is something that I find quite interesting, that you're quite a transhumanist, actually, and you're like someone who really believes that technology could make us better in the future, or like we could have a radically better future with technology, basically. But you also have dedicated a lot of your career to working on existential risk. Could you tell us, what was your journey there? How did you come to that?
So usually I say that it was so boring growing up in Sweden in the 1970s that I devoured all the science fiction novels at the local library. And then I wanted to make them real, and I realized I should probably read the science books, and I never stopped on that area. So I got interested in science and making the world more interesting, getting us to the future, which meant that I joined up with the transhumanist movement in the 90s. I did websites and debates, and generally was very much in favor of let's use technology in a smart way to make ourselves smarter, more long-lived, better, and along all dimensions of better we can come up with. And then back in the early 2000s, I encountered this paper just written by Nick Bostrom, talking about a new concept, existential risk. And I hated the paper. I really disliked it because he pointed out that many of the technologies that I felt were really cool and really potentially powerful could have downsides that could wipe us out. And I felt, oh no, this is going to be used by Luddites and other people who don't want to enhance technology as an argument against doing them. And then I interacted with Nick, and over the years I realized actually he's got a pretty good point. We want to get to the future, but we want to get to a good future. And if you think that the future could be radically much better, then it's also fairly plausible that it could be radically much worse. Thinking that it's only possible for things to get better, that is a rather weird position. And if you think that we have agency over the future, that we can actually determine to some extent whether it goes well or bad, okay, then we better work hard on making it go better. So this is usually why I explain that I sleep very well at night thinking that, okay, maybe I'm helping make the future a better way by avoiding dreadful scenarios. If you're a pessimist about the future, in that case, you might say, actually, maybe it's better to have an asteroid hit the Earth and be done with it. Or you might say, yeah, bad things are happening and we can't do anything about it. In which case you might still just go down to the pub and take a glass instead of actually doing something. You need to be an optimist about that the future can become better and that you can help it become better. But even if you're wrong about that, you're going to have a rather interesting life. So I'm very happy working on existential risk from a very optimistic foundation.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very good summary, like you have to care about the future to want to save it a little bit. So this course, the reason I really wanted to have you on basically is I know you do also a lot of work on like neurotechnology and some quite out there ideas about what could be done or like what the future could be with neurotech. So do you maybe want to just prime people and tell them a little bit about when you think about neurotechnology, what makes you excited about what we could do with neurotechnology?
So our brains and minds are really the core of everything we do. Whatever we think is good in life involves the mind in some way. Whether you think it's achieving happiness or tranquility or doing meaningful things, you still need that brain to do it. You need to have a good memory. You need to be able to think through your actions, or you might need the self-control to meditate and achieve enlightenment or whatever. So that means that if we could affect the brain, we could have a big impact on practically everything that matters. So one question is, can we enhance the brain? So I did my early work at Oxford, working on the ethics of cognitive enhancement. Are there drugs or electromagnetic treatments or anything else that can make us think better? And what are the ethical and social impacts of that? But we can go beyond that. Maybe we can add features to the brain that doesn't exist right now. Maybe there are new modes of thinking. Maybe we could extend our memories long beyond what normal memory works, or add entirely new modalities, ways of interacting with the world that doesn't exist yet. After all, we might want to add senses. There are some people who have implanted magnets in their fingertips so they can sense magnetic fields. And the most interesting part about that is that although the nerve impulses coming in, they're from the touch sensors in the fingertip responding to the magnet moving slightly, they get interpreted after a while by the brain as something different from touch because it's uncorrelated with the normal touch sensations. The brain is very good at connecting to new senses and maybe different bodies. So one question is, can we extend this? And then, of course, comes the idea, could we connect our brains to computers? Both to control computers, but also maybe to use computing to think better, or experience virtual reality, or do things that we cannot even think of right now. The really big idea that I'm probably going to be spending most time here talking about is brain emulation. What if we could actually move our minds out of our heads and into a computer? The idea is that maybe we can scan the brain in a suitable way and make a replica in a computer. And that replica could have the same experience as we do. This raises enormous can of worms of philosophy, of course. Many people say immediately, wait a minute, that can't be me, that's a copy. And we get the question about what is personal identity? There are questions about, can software actually be conscious? And of course, very practical questions like, how easy is it to scan brains and replicate them in computers? Which turns out to be not easy at all, but a really interesting long-term potential.
Yeah, I think let's dive into the whole brain emulation can of worms. What do you think would be the most exciting? What's the really positive future that you see with that? What are the most positive implications? And then I think we should also obviously touch on the I know you just hosted an ethics of whole brain emulation conference. So maybe we dive a bit into that as well. But let's start with the positive. What do you see exciting?
The most obvious thing is that having a backup of your mind is a very, very valuable thing. So even if we succeed really well with life extension or finding other ways of preserving our bodies, sooner or later our rock will run out and we get run over by a truck or a meteor hits us or something else goes wrong. If you had a backup and could download it in a suitable body, whether that's a virtual body or a robot body or a cloned Android body, cool. Now you have a much better chance of surviving. And of course, existing in a computer means that you can think as fast as that computer allows. Right now, most of our neural simulations are relatively slow compared to actual brains, but there is no reason why we couldn't make them faster. Moore's law applies here, and you might actually think much faster than a biological brain can think, because nerve impulses move roughly at the speed of sound, while of course a computer can move things at nearly the speed of light. And then you can start thinking about, wait a minute, if I want to go to America from the UK, I can get my body onto a plane and to get through airports and all of that. Or maybe I could send it by internet. I could just download in a suitable body over there. And why just think about this for America? Why not go to Mars this way? And we can also start thinking about, wait a minute, I have a lot of problems with my brain. Maybe we can debug it a bit. We can actually start removing some of the cognitive errors. We can explore ways of enhancing it. And maybe I add some parts or change some parts, and it turns out to be a bad idea. No problem. Just press undo. And this, of course, gets to the really wild aspects of this, because there is no reason why I couldn't be running 2 copies of the program Anders. So now there would be at least 2 Anderses. This is usually where a lot of people say, wait a minute, there can only be one of you. But I disagree. I think my view of personal identity is that I'm multiply realizable. There can be multiple versions of me, and all of them are me in some wider sense. But this might very well not be true for other people who got a definition of personal identity that might be tied, for example, to the body, or might be tied to there actually only being one, the true prime person. So there are many cool philosophical questions here, but I think there are a lot of practical utility if we could do this brain emulation. But of course, getting there is going to be a tough process. And while you can probably imagine a lot of interesting ethical problems once we're there, even the road there is going to be tricky, because we need to do a lot of animal experiments before getting there. So there is the usual ethical issues, of course, about using animals in research. But even if you treat the animals well, there is the question, how do you treat the virtual animals? If I have taken a mouse and scanned its brain and reconstructed it in a computer, and now the virtual mouse is running around in the simulated cage, if I now take on a virtual reality glove and reach in and pinch its virtual simulated tail, then simulated nerve impulses reach its brain, and maybe the little sim mouse squeals and runs off in a corner, behaving just like a real mouse would do if I pinched its tail. But it's not nice to pinch mice tails. If you do that for no good reason in a lab, actually that is bad in the research ethics. The question is it okay to pinch virtual mice tails? I would say, nah, probably not. If I think that the simulation of my brain would be conscious in a computer, I should probably expect the mouse in the simulation to be equally conscious. And in that case, I should treat it just as I would treat a normal mouse. I think this is a reasonable position, but it's also going to complicate a lot of the research, because now we need to be much more careful about our virtual lab animals. We need to give them good environments that they actually enjoy being in, which is tricky because the world of a mouse is very different from our world. You need to have a much better smell simulation than we would in a virtual reality for humans. We are very visual beings and we care about how stuff looks, but mice generally go for touch and smell. So there is a real challenge of doing this in an ethical manner. But the really deep questions, of course, happen once you get to humans, because now you might get entities in the computer that really matters morally. But at the same time, that process might produce bad brain scans. So now we have a somewhat broken version that we might care about. Does that mean that we must never run the bad version of that brain scan? Or maybe we should try to reconstruct it, or wait until we in the future figure out a way of repairing it? Not to mention, of course, many of the other issues about safety and security. If I'm finding myself on a computer, I'm at the mercy of whoever controls the physical hardware. I better trust those guys not to pull the plug or make a lot of copies and put up on a torrenting site online.
Yeah, that's definitely the can of worms has been opened. So I think one thing, just to take a step back, because I think most people, maybe when they hear this, they probably haven't heard about this before. That would be my best guess, that most people in the world hasn't heard about this. That you and I are in this like bubble where this is something that is actually like talked about. What is like the scientific consensus? Do you have a timeline on when do you think that this could actually happen?
It's probably a while before it happens, although the timeline is getting faster and I'm surprised every day by cool results. It's still a very hard project. But the real story about brain emulation actually started in the 1940s. So back then, we didn't actually know how nerve fibers transmit information. So Hodgkin and Huxley did this classic set of experiments. They used nerves from giant squid, because they're either big and they're easy to keep alive in a lab. And they figured out what's going on in a nerve fiber. And basically it has to do with sodium and potassium ions flowing across the cell membrane, creating a little electrical potential. It's a bit like a row of domino bricks falling over. Ion channels open, the ions rush through them, that triggers the next channel over, and you get a cascade sending an impulse along the fiber. Now, the cool thing here was not just that they did a simulation, or rather they did the experiment, but they did a simulation. And remember, this is the 1940s, early 1950s. They didn't have modern computers. They had a hand-cranked calculator, and they literally spent weeks solving the equations they had used to model this, and managed to get the curve of electric impulse, and it fitted the data really well. So that was the first simulated nerve cell, or even a part of a nerve cell. Ever since, people have been building more and more elaborate models. So we take data from actual nerve cells and simulate them and use it both to understand the biology better, but also get inspiration for an artificial intelligence. The idea of neural networks, which are currently the big deal in AI, comes partially from mimicking what's going on inside the brain, where you have a lot of simple components, the nerve cells, connected in a network, where you can update the connections between them depending on what you learn. And while the neural networks that is now running in the AI systems are very different from the actual biology, and in many cases totally non-biological, they have a root in this thinking that a distributed system can do quite a lot of thinking. Meanwhile, over in computational neuroscience, where people are trying to mimic biology, we did more and more elaborate models, larger simulations. So today, it's not uncommon to see simulations that have millions or even billions of nerve cells, and some of them with quite exquisite biological detail. Many of them are also simplified because we want to run them faster and more effectively, or study other things. And there is an interesting link here to systems biology, where people are trying to simulate other things going on in the body. Because obviously nerve cells are not just sitting there in empty space. They're surrounded by tissue. They're surrounded by the bloodstream. They're surrounded by chemicals coming from the body, from our gut, and so on. So you can try to model this, which is, of course, very interesting if you're in medicine and trying to figure out pharmaceuticals, trying to figure out, can I get a depressed neural network to be less depressed, and what chemicals would be useful for that? But the problem is, of course, do I know my simulation is a correct model of the actual work? It would be so good if I could check with a real brain and scan it. So the state of the art right now is building up connectomes, where you try to figure out which nerve cells are connected to which in an organism. The first full connectome was for the little nematode worm C. elegans, which was actually found in the 1980s. What they found there, they took the C. elegans, they put it in plastic, they sliced it up, they used an electron microscope to figure out which cells are where, and by hand they worked out a connectivity between the 303 nerve cells. It's not a big brain, but even that one turned out to be tricky to simulate. So although it would be very easy to just run it on anybody's smartphone, even a pretty old smartphone, the problem is the connections, the strength of the synapses and their electrical properties are hard to measure because it's a really tiny worm. So more recently, a few years back, the researchers at Google did a connectome of a fruit fly brain. Fruit flies are the workhorse in biology. They're easy to rear, they got interesting biology, they got interesting genetics, and it turns out that now we have a full set of the nerve cells inside a fruit fly. And that's cool. But it's still a dry brain. It's just nerve cells and the shape and the connectivity. There is no information about their electrical properties, which are very different between different nerve cells. And then there was a bunch of researchers who wondered, could we just take the images of these nerve cells and try to make educated guesses what connections there are? And they came up with something that turns out to be surprisingly good. It's not perfect, but it's 90% correct. And then there was a bunch of other researchers who wondered, what if we make a very simple model of electrical activity and take those data and run it? And they discovered that they could replicate some of the behavior of a real fruit fly. Not all of it. It's not like we're having a virtual fruit fly running. But if you send signals from a neuron that reacts to sweet taste on one side, then that triggers other nerve cells that start to activate the neurons that would normally move the proboscis of a fly to that side. If you stimulate on the other side, the virtual proboscis would be moving in the other direction. There is one nerve cell, but if you trigger that one, the fruit fly twirls around in the same spot. And it seems to be doing exactly the same thing in this little simulation. This is very cool because it's a very crude model. It was not really designed to be a simulation of actual activity. It's just what existed in that little tiny head. But this is the state of art for the moment. And now more and more people are saying, oh, we really would like to have a mouse brain. That's probably a few years away, but I know several teams working on it. I'm involved in some projects making roadmaps on what do we need to figure out to make it work. What kind of research are needed? What kind of new microscopes or robotics or chemical staining to figure out the biochemistry, or new ways of using AI to do part of the research, because there's going to be so much data and so much of it is going to not work on the first try. And we need to have AI systems help us debug and fix things on the fly as we're moving forward.
Yeah, AI, I'm sure, can help speed these things up. And I would also just recommend the TV show Pantheon, which I saw is on Netflix now, actually, which
It's
is
brilliant.
Yeah, it's by far the best thing I've ever seen in terms of showing all the like tension when, there's a new technology. Basically, people are in this TV show able to upload, and you can see the beginnings of it and all the challenges and the tension. But you can also, if you watch until the end, see, okay, that actually seems that's a really interesting future, basically, to explore once you follow it through, basically.
It's an interesting show because it shows people changing opinions as they're exposed to new possibility. Not necessarily all of them embracing the technology. Some of them change opinion in the opposite direction. And there are many very big challenges. Of course, it's partially based on fictional assumptions of what you can do if you're uploaded. But it still makes for a very good and thought-provoking show. And I think in reality, when we're getting these technologies, that's going to change the world very profoundly. And it's very valuable to think ahead before that happens. What are we going to do when it gets more likely? When the first little virtual mouse is running around in a big data center, that's a sign that, okay, humans are maybe 20 years ahead. That gives us maybe 20 years or maybe 10 years to get ready for a world where people might have backup copies, where we might have to discuss the rights of virtual people and all the weird problems in contract law that happens if I make a contract and then I make a copy, several copies, and now which of these copies is bound by that contract?
Yeah. Can of worms, as we've stated before.
Oh, yeah. And the interesting part here is that some people say, yeah, that's so problematic that we shouldn't be doing it. But then again, we're always doing problematic things. And many cans of worms, like what about ownership when we have things in computers and as digital files? The lawyers are dealing with these cans of worms, and some of them are pretty big and very important, billions at stake. But human societies are good at adapting and finding creative ways to adapt that make everybody happy. It's hard, but it's also worth doing. And we have been doing it in the past. So I'm optimistic that, yeah, these neurotechnologies are going to be giving a lot of lawyers, neuroscientists, philosophers, and normal people headaches of various kinds. But I also believe that we're going to be better off once we get past those headaches. And of course, if you have a biological brain, you can always take a headache pill. And if you got a virtual brain, you can do the same virtual thing. You can just adjust the neural network to say that, okay, now I'm not feeling any pain from my virtual head.
Yeah. We're at time already. Is there anything else that you just want to say, wrap up on all of these crazy topics and the potential of neurotechnology before we close?
So Arthur C. Clarke, in one of his essays about how to think about the future, pointed out that there is a long history of experts saying that, oh, that is not a possible technology. And then, of course, he has a long list of people saying that you cannot go to space or you cannot build a heavy aircraft or a computer. And he notes, of course, that when a famous professor says something is possible to do, they're usually right. And when they say it's impossible, they're usually wrong. But more importantly, when they give arguments, typically it's because they have a failure of imagination. They can't imagine that some problems that they see are big problems can be solved. But of course, there are many brains out there in the world. Many of them are usually smarter than one's own brain. So there are quite often solutions to problems that you cannot personally solve. This is why it's good to reach out to others. And you also need to have the nerve. And Clark talk about failure of nerve, because sometimes you make a prediction and it sounds crazy. And a lot of people say, oh, that sounds crazy, let's not go there. Instead of thinking, that sounds crazy. What happens if we go there? What are the implications? Can we do something so it's good crazy rather than bad crazy? So I think we need to have the imagination and nerve to go through with it. That's my kind of final point.
That's a great, very existential, hopey point. Let's do the good, crazy things. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Anders.
Thank you. This has been so much fun.